Hi, it's been a while. It's time to do another watch list. 5 recommendations, 5 movies that are out in boutique Blu-ray. And we'll start with a HMV premium collection release. Might have been more archive and some other life or otherwise, but it is Jeremiah Johnson, starring Robert Redford and directed by Sidney Pollack. Now, I've done a couple of westernish movies over the past while, but this one's slightly different. It's set after the Mexican-American War, and it stars Robert Redford as Jeremiah Johnson, who is a man who just wants to get away from it all. He wants to forget about life and the war and head up into the mountains and be a mountain man. And he sets off and he starts off with life as a trapper and living in isolation. We get the first part of the film with him trying to be by himself and build skills as a trapper, and he comes across various people, both alive and dead, and builds relationships with them and gets gear from them. For instance, he gets an upgrade in his rifle as he finds a man dead in the snow, and the will that's been left by the man basically says, whoever finds my body gets to keep the rifle, which is a pretty good thing. And he meets some indigenous people there, and he has a bit of a run-in. He disturbs a hunt of another local as well. So he starts to build both relationships, both positive and negative, with the people that are around him. Still, at the heart of it all, he just wants to be left well alone. Doesn't really want to be bothered by anybody. And so he tries to ignore it and eschew it all. But he starts to get a bit of a reputation as being a man who knows what he's doing in and around that area. So people come to him looking for his skills. And in fact, he's trying to eschew domestic life so much that it kind of finds him. He finds a woman and her son living in distress after events that have happened to them, and he kind of finds himself domesticated, kind of against what he wanted. And while he certainly incorporates that in his life, that becomes his new normal. Those become his family, and he starts to set about life. But again, it's not really in his nature. And as people ask him and pull him around to do various things for them in lieu of him contributing to society, he finds that he really doesn't want to. So that's the setup for Jeremiah Johnson. And, well, I think it's kind of brilliant. It's a beautifully shot movie. It uses most of its locations and the cinematography that are in there. And Sidney Pollack as a director is one that doesn't get talked about very much now. But if you put that together with even something like Tootsie, you get something that is pretty great. I mean, I love Tootsie, the Dustin Hoffman film. It's out in Criterion. I probably should talk about it in some way. But Sidney Pollack as a filmmaker, you know, he's a pretty good catalogue of film there in his back catalogue, and this is another one certainly to add. To that end, the release that we have here, the HMV Premium Collection, it's one of their classic kind of ones which have, you know, the Blu-ray release inside. It has these bloody postcards which I never know what to do with. And it also has a DVD copy as well, so it's dual format and these postcards. Again, see if somebody can think of a way or invent something that can make us use these postcards. It could be really on the winner with the Blu-ray collecting community. But it also has a commentary and a featurette as well, which are... the featurette is kind of... I always find it with these ones, they're a bit too studio-produced glossy. I think to really be taken seriously. I think we're kind of spoiled in modern times with the likes of the Arrow interviews where people are talking about something a bit off the fact, and they're like, actually, it wasn't all flowers and roses in that production. It was very much, you know, tough going. I didn't like that person. This one's very glitzy and glamoury. But there's also the commentary there with Sidney Pollack, Robert Redford, and John Milius, who is the writer. So, an interesting release of a great film. I mean, certainly by its own right, the film stands up by itself. Doesn't need an awful lot to sit with it. But you get something extra with it. Is it good? So that's us. First up is a film that I watched from some recent release by Eureka, and part of their Montage Pictures sub-label, which looks at world cinema. Now, I've talked a bit about Montage Pictures over the past while, and this is the latest release, which is Midnight. It stars some people that people will recognise from other shows such as Squid Game. I ain't seen Squid Game, so I'm going to judge it on merit alone, and it's a I mean, it's down as a horror, but it's much more of a thriller. And it tells the story of, well, this man who's going around basically murdering people, picking people up off the street and murdering them, throwing them into a van and torturing them and killing them. And we see some of that at the start, but he runs into, or comes across, a girl who is deaf, and her deaf mother, they can only sign. Aside from this, we have this side story of a brother and a sister combination. We've got an overprotective brother. The sister wants to go out for the night, kind of doesn't want the overprotective or overbearing brother to pay too much attention, and she goes missing as well. And he seems a bit of a military sort, definitely knows how to handle himself, and it goes in. So we have this protagonist who's going around killing people. We have this kind of hard head. We have the deaf girl and her mother. It's very sweet, but this is a film that totally relies on the strength of their performances in between. The guy's the killer, is the sociopath. He's very charismatic. He gets people to believe him, and he uses it very much to his advantage. But it's the performance of the young deaf girl and her mother that really capture the sense of dread and threat and worry that many people will see in this film. And you know, it runs right through the end. You kind of watch the film and think after about half an hour, you've seen all the tricks that it has to show. You see everything maybe that it has to offer, but it keeps on throwing different and new things at you. Certainly at the core of it, it's just somebody getting chased for an hour and a half, hour 40, whatever it is. But it keeps on throwing things back at you. And it's another solid entry into this Montage Pictures release line. This one actually has a documentary on Korean cinema as well, which really, you know, I think is something that's worth buying for the release alone. I mean, it's not super long, and it's something that you'll really get an awful lot of enjoyment out of. So it adds up to a bit more than your vanilla release for Montage, because some of them can tend to be a bit vanilla-ish. They kind of just present the film as they are, which is fine. They only cost a few pounds here and there, so you'd be forgiven for just picking it up and throwing it on the shelf as a movie to watch. But I think Midnight is one that has some rewatch value. A lot of films like these kind of thrillerish kind of feel like one watches or something that you could watch once and throw away. But I think there's more to Midnight, and it was something I really enjoyed, and it was, you know, like many Korean films, it has this pace right the way through it that kind of drags and pulls you along with it. A really good watch. Staying in Asia, and staying with Eureka as it is, we go to, well, I'll do one of the two films that are in this release, and forgive me for showing this, but this is the Jewel Pack of Warriors 2 and the Prodigal Son. Now, I don't think this is some of the best artwork, especially front cover artwork, as it kind of does this two-panel thing, as you'll see here. But I'm not a big fan of it, to be honest. But we are going to talk about The Prodigal Son. Both films are quite good. They're both Sammo Hung films. But this second one, The Prodigal Son, stars Yan Bio as well. And, you know, it kind of eschews some of the tropes of the genre, the Kung Fu genre. Like, I've watched a lot of these over the past while. If anybody's been following along on the channel, they know that I've been watching a lot of the Eureka releases and the Shaw Brothers releases. And I have to say, some of these releases that have come out don't always, you know, kind of stand apart from the Shaw Brothers releases, but this feels very Shaw Brothers. We have a character who is introduced at the very start of the film as being the greatest in the land. You know, he's unbeatable. Nobody can touch him. And he walks about with a certain preening himself and a certain shoulders back, look at me. But it turns out that it's just his father been paying everybody off to kind of throw the fight. And he isn't actually any good at Kung Fu. In fact, he's absolutely useless, as it turns out. And, you know, you have a character who thinks he's one thing, finds out he's another one. And there's that internal conflict. So he decides, through some manipulations of the storyline or otherwise, that he needs a better teacher, and he is going to get a better teacher. It's going to be Sammo Hung, as it turns out. And it doesn't take too much for me to tell you that, okay, he gets a new teacher, he's going to learn skills, there's that kind of apprenticeship starts, but he's going to have to prove himself at some stage throughout the film, and that's what it is. And while there's nothing really past that point, it'll blow your mind. You obviously get your fight sequences. You'll get your silliness, as there often is in a Sammo Hung film. You have Yambio, like I say, is in there as well. There's a lot of strong performances right throughout it, and like the action always speaks for itself. But it plays with a bit of fun with some of those tropes, and as you see more and more of these types of films, I think this is something that I'm coming to enjoy even more, is where they play with it a little bit, or they turn it in its head a little bit, or they change something ever so slightly, and you have a fun film that definitely deserves a watch. And you know, it could be said that a lot of these things are quite similar. A lot of these releases are quite similar. And certainly when I started watching them, that was generally my feeling. I kind of thought these all feel very similar. But they all have their own little flavour. And they all have their own little touch in it that makes it, that separate it from another one. And when they all seem to have similar settings or similar time periods, it lends them the a common theme that means there's easy entry into watching these. And Warriors 2 is a pretty decent film as well. It kind of plays with the trope of having the two warriors having the duality of the fight there, which is cool. But you know, we have pretty full featured releases here from Eureka, and while I don't really love the artwork of this one, in general I have loved this kind of colorization. The spines that they do for all the ones that are here, like Dreadnought and Knockabout, etc., they've come out afterwards, they all line up pretty nicely and create what is a collectible collection of Kung Fu films that kind of sits alongside the 88 films, Shaw Brothers releases, and sits alongside the Arrow Shaw Brothers box. And you know, I have to say, I probably said it before, kind of can't get enough of this Kung Fu stuff. It's not a genre that I was ever really interested in before, but as you delve in and you watch the extras and you see the interviews and you see the common people that are involved in both, and some of the big stars that are there, obviously, you can't help but be drawn in to that world of Kung Fu and kind of go, more please, more. Staying over that side of the world, we're going to go to Australia, and you know, I've been on a bit of a binge of Australian cinema as well, and I've been eschewing the virtues of this Sunburnt Screens line from Umbrella Entertainment, and this one I've watched is Breaker Morant. Now this is also out in Criterion, so you'll find a version there, and there's a good reason it's out in Criterion. I think this is a stunning movie. I mean, Prodigal Son's fun, Midnight's interesting fun, Jeremiah Johnson is kind of storied in that big character. I think this is the best movie that I'm going to talk about today. Breaker Morant tells a story of three men who are put in trial for killing Boer prisoners in the Boer War. Now they're being made scapegoats. It's made very early on that they're scapegoats for what is an ongoing peace process, and to kind of eschew any responsibility of one side of the responsibility for war crimes, they're going to throw these three men to the wolves. They set them up with a patsy trial, and they sent a patsy guy to defend them. Except this guy isn't just a patsy. While his reputation mightn't be great, he's very serious about his job, and he defends them to the hilt, and he puts up a much more fervent and vigorous defence than anybody was expecting. He's played by Jack Thompson, and here's Jack Thompson again. I mean, I do like a bit of Jack Thompson. This also has Edward Woodward, and it has Brian Brown in it as well. It has, again, that bevy of Australian character actor that ended up in soap. So you've had Framsey here as well for a while. It's a bit of a rat bastard, if you know what I'm saying, in it. But you have a story at the end that is, it's deeply affecting, and I really felt, you know, drawn and taken in with the characters as they basically telling the story about whether they were acting under orders or whether they were, you know, acting off their own back. And the story plays with not telling you and showing you exactly what happened up front, but kind of dealing out the story in piecemeal. And it's a true story. I mean, this disc itself has got two extremely lengthy documentaries that go with it that tell the story, one from further back, one from more recent, about the actual story of Breaker Morant and how this story kind of ended up in Australian folklore, so to speak. And it's an absolutely brilliant film. I mean, it's a good looking print, and it's hard not to be drawn into this world of Australian cinema because there's so many rich stories that are being told. Like this Sunburnt Screens line is kind of the one that I look at and go, God, I want something that's it's going to be a bit different from what I currently watch. So if I've been watching a bit of Kung Fu, or I've been watching a bit of classic British cinema or something, you want something different. This is the line that is doing it for me, because it tells me something different all the time. And every film that I've seen from this line is well picked, it's well restored, it creates good stories that go with it, etc. I think this line is utterly brilliant, and definitely should be celebrated. And whether you're picking up the Criterion version or the Umbrella Entertainment version that I have here, Eureka Morant is a story, it's a true story that is told with love, care, and reverence for the subject material. And the last film I'm going to talk about is Circus of Horrors, part of the Studiocanal Vintage Classics line. And like many of those films, it's a British film of a certain vintage, this one from about 1960. And it's a bit of an oddity from about that time, because it's pretty much a horror film. And I know like 1960s British horror is a well-known genre. Hammer were really starting to get into their groove around that time, and there was a lot of films coming out around that time, but this is a bit of an oddity. And it's alluded to in the disc, and a lot of what I'm going to say to you comes from my watching of the disc, and that is the fact that there were a number of films, including this one, that kind of seemed to escape the British Board of Classification at the time, because they pushed the boundaries of what was normally being out at the time. It's very sadistic, it's very nihilistic, and it's a bit gruesome in places, especially for the time. By today's standards, I mean, you'll not be worried about God hiding behind the settee or anything, but it definitely fits into that idea. So what was Circus of Horrors about? It follows a doctor who's a cosmetic doctor, or somebody that did facial reconstructions, and he is famed, he's very full of ego, and he botches one of his operations, so much so that the woman is very badly disfigured, and he has to flee the country for fear of getting brought to trial or otherwise being thrown out. So as part of his hiding, and because, well, I don't really know why, he decides to take over a circus and gets control of a circus. And you know, you think, okay, that's a weird plot, but I'll go with it. And so he doesn't just take over the circus, he starts bringing people into the circus that are already exist in acts, of course, but he goes out looking for people who are also disfigured and also could do with aid of his work, and he builds their face again and makes them beautiful in return for them being part of his act in his circus. Again, okay, I mean, it's a stretch, but, you know, again, it's a film, I'll go with it. And then those people get fame, and that they are beautiful and all of that stuff, and they decide they want to leave, and before they can leave, they meet some weird and wonderful gruesome deaths. Aha, says you. Now you see what this is all in the end of. So there's quite an elaborate setup for these kind of murders, or these kind of grisly ends, that I think if you're turning up to the cinema to see something of this ilk, you'll have wanted to see. And it certainly pulls it off. I mean, some of the deaths, some of the things are a bit telegraphed by today's standards. Maybe they've been seen an awful lot back then. They might have been more fresh and gnarly. But I think, you know, they're not surprised. But it made for an enjoyable watch and an enjoyable film, and again a curiosity in terms of British cinema. This vintage classics line that Studiocanal do, I can't really think of too many that I didn't really get something, you know, interesting out of. Now this is also a good film. It's got Anton Diffring as the main character, and in this kind of slew of other character actors in what is pretty much a rotating cast based on the plot of beautiful women. It very much ticks a lot of those boxes for 1960s British cinema. There was a sort of checklist that went on to it, but like these releases, if they aren't just interesting films or classic films, they certainly showcase performers or actors who were prominent around that time, and you get to see a good feel of their work. Really enjoyed the release. As well, it has a 20-minute conversation with Kim Newman. Tick, says you, because if you're anything like me, you can't go wrong with a bit of Kim Newman. With his bookcase behind him, with his book showcasing, you must be like me and kind of Google the name of some of those books to see what they are. Maybe it is just me. And it also has about a 25-26 minute appreciation of the film as well, which is another big tick, because I think it is a film that was worth discussing. You probably get the idea from what I'm talking to you now. There's an interesting release in there. And yeah, a pretty good all-round release. And that's my watch list. I haven't done one in a while, as I've been saying. So there's 5 recommendations for you to pick up. Kind of a bit all over the place. I hope you've got something out of it. Some you may have seen, some you may have not. As usual, if you've seen them, get down in the comments, we'll have a conversation. You know I do like to converse at length down in the comments. If you made it this far, thank you very much. But don't forget to add your own watch list or what you've been watching in the comments so that then it can be my watch list. I'll catch us again soon. Take care.